We're here at the American Dairy Science Association meetings where we've been interviewing students and talking about the research that they've been conducting over the last year or so. With us today is Dr. Tom Overton. Tom, you're not a student anymore.
I am not a student.
But Allison Kerwin was the young lady that did the research. Now we're going to be reviewing 3 separate abstracts that Allison worked on. First, tell us why Allison's not here.
So Allison had her second baby back in the wintertime, and so
Nice.
she's kind of finishing up her maternity leave. She's been taking that kind of in phases and decided that maybe Kansas City and 100-degree temperatures with a 6-month-old wasn't really the great plan, so it probably makes sense.
Yeah, congratulations, Allison. Wish you could be here. Tom, we've got 3 abstracts that we've kind of lumped together. Going to talk about those. Can you kind of give us an overview of what they were?
Yeah, so Allison, for her PhD, conducted one of the, I would think, probably the largest scope transition cow management studies in commercial farms that's really been done. 72 herds in New York and Vermont. Visited larger freestall dairies. She visited each dairy 4 times, and as she likes to remind me, drove about 58,000 miles in the course of doing the data collection for this study. So it's a large study, a lot of data, and we're starting to roll it out not only within Journal of Dairy Science, but also obviously here at the meetings.
Yeah, excellent. Now, Tom, I usually have one co-host that joins me for these podcasts. Today, for somebody with your level of expertise, I had to have 2. So with me, I've got Dr. Marco Zanobi and Dr. Jeff Elliott, and I talked about a lot of data to go through. I'm going to leave it to these guys to kind of dig into the data with you. So, gentlemen.
So, actually, the first question I want to ask goes back a few years, maybe to grad school days. I want to know why you knocked my dog's tooth out.
Yeah, I really feel badly about that. We were roughhousing a little bit, and I do feel bad for Dutch.
Yeah,
but
was his name.
He's quite a.
I still remember the tooth just flying away.
Yeah, I remember other things in graduate school too. If you'd like to talk about those, they're not.
No, we need to skip those stories.
Okay.
What was the idea behind this big project? Why you wanted to do this? I mean, what is the story behind?
Yeah, so going back into the kind of the 2005 to 2008 time frame, we did a large study with Daryl Neidham. Daryl Neidham was the lead at Cornell. Our group was collaborative on it and also very involved, in which we looked at 100 herds, looked at relationships of NEFAs and blood ketones with outcomes on dairies. And so we had some nice data from that data set that really, or results anyway, that kind of provided the basis for how we do cow and herd level NEFA and blood ketone testing these days. But one of the things we realized at the time is we really didn't do a very good job or a very thorough job of characterizing all the nutritional and non-nutritional factors that can contribute to herd level success. And so, we really wanted to take this opportunity to do a much more in-depth characterization of those factors. And so, Allison, along with our collaborators, Buzz Burhans and Daryl Neidham, again in this case, as primary collaborators, we were really focused on what we wanted to try to collect. Both from the standpoint of nutritional strategies of herds, but also the various things that we know at the pen level and at the herd level, contribute on the non-nutritional side, to outcomes. And I think we're much more sensitized to those relationships now than we were then. And so that was kind of how the study was born. Was an attempt to do a much more thorough job and then try to relate some of those management practices or other characteristics at the herd level, to our outcomes and also to productivity and reproductive function and herd health.
Okay. So, can you share with us the main result, the main important result from this?
Yeah. So I think there's a few different things to share. 2 of the papers are now published in Journal of Dairy Science. So we've published now the data set, right? So people can see, really what the characteristics of the herds were in all these different areas. We published the second paper; those are all now available, where we looked at again, kind of covering some of the same area that we did before relative to relationships of things like blood NEFAs and ketones with our outcomes of interest, and results were quite similar to the previous work, and so that part we feel good about that the recommendations we've been making for the industry kind of still hold. The one unique part of it was we actually looked at inflammatory markers, especially haptoglobin as a marker of inflammation, in those cows. in the data set, and probably not of surprise to people. We associated, and again, these are all associative things. These are
Exactly.
epidemiological studies. We associated higher levels of haptoglobin postpartum as a marker of systemic inflammation with more disease, with poor milk production or with poor reproductive performance. So that kind of extends that data. Again, adds to our growing knowledge of inflammation in that postpartum cow and what it might mean at the herd level.
So Tom, on that, the result was high forage resulted in higher levels of haptoglobin, I believe.
Well, I think it depended, right? I mean, there was some of that. Again, with the epi data sets, they're always a little bit of, you always got to think through the interpretation. I mean, some of the things I think, especially with the nutritional side, are very consistent with the literature as we know it, right? So cows fed a more, controlled energy diet, a lower energy diet, during the prepartum period, had lower blood ketones, postpartum, and that fits our knowledge from the control literature. The haptoglobin story, I think, is still a bit interesting in terms of not really fully understanding how diet can affect that. And so both prepartum diet and also postpartum diet. I think there's parts of it that are clearer than others, but there's still more to.
And that's where my curiosity comes in. Actually, on Friday, Marcos and I had a webinar with a customer, and not related to this abstract at all, but he says, haptoglobin, the correct, or is it the most accurate biomarker that we need to be using, or is it a cytokine or another messenger?
Yeah. So I think that area is still kind of wide open, honestly. We chose haptoglobin in part because we had previous data that we'd done at the commercial farm level where we were able to, in a smaller data set, but still, 400 cows worth of data associate elevated haptoglobin with negative relationships with outcomes. That was some of Julie Huzzy's PhD work in our program. There's other markers. There's serum amyloid A, another acute phase protein. Both those tend to elevate in especially with ruminal or gut type inflammatory processes. But again, I think the thing with acute phase proteins is they'll elevate, with any kind of systemic inflammation. Cytokines, I think those are all, those are all on the table relative to how we might, think about relationships with outcomes and things like that. And again, it's associations. I think one of the things that gets a little bit, if you lock a bunch of immunologists or others in a room for 24 hours and tell them to come up with one marker to measure immune function, right? They'll probably debate it for 24 hours and probably still won't come out with any. I mean, again, yeah. And I always say, I don't say it to make any, to make fun of anything other than just to convey it's a complex area, right? And complex to interpret. And so I think, we may end up with a suite of markers at the end of the day that we may look at some of these things for something that gives us a little different look than we get out of our energy-related analytes like NEFAs and ketones and things like that.
So to change gears a little bit, to go to the more nutritional strategies.
Yep.
What did the findings here tell us about feeding starch relative in the close-up period as well as the fresh cow period? Because y'all have done a lot of work there over the years.
Yep.
It's always been intriguing.
Our data set in this case, actually, that one was one of the clearer things in that, cows fed the higher starch diet post-calving anyway, did have lower blood ketones, and so, that would appear to be an advantage. One of the things that was, was also interesting is that, we did not pick up any clear relationships with milk yield, right, for any of the kind of nutritional strategies we looked at. I don't think that means that it doesn't matter, right? I think that's probably a bit of an oversimplification.
I was going to ask that, because that's the way it comes across. But I
realize that, right? But I mean, at the same time, I think there's, I think one of the things to remember here, especially when you're looking at epidemiological data set, is, we're making choices in terms of how we look at the data, okay, and across a range of outcomes. Now, if we do a controlled research study, right, I can compare this level starch with this level starch and be far apart, okay, and be very different diets. Well, that's not the real world, right? Here you're looking at, and I'm not going to say a continuum because we're trying to target lower or higher in certain cases, but commercial farm diets don't vary as much as what you're going to come up with in a controlled research situation, right? If Marcos here were to do a controlled study, he's going to really look to define some treatment differences and do that, right?
Yep.
So, so I think that's part of it, right? So again, I certainly don't think it doesn't matter. We clearly have enough information from the controlled research, right? And of course, you guys have meta-analyses on choline. There's meta-analyses on DK. Not put all back on meta-analyses, right? But that clearly show production relationships with some of these nutritional strategies, right?
Yep.
And so again, we do these epi studies in part to extend the control research knowledge, right, or try to see how it plays out in the real world, but then also generate hypotheses that we might go back and test.
Right.
So I will go back to the close-up then.
Mm-hmm.
A simple question. So there was no association, although, of NDF level with any of the outcomes, but there was an association with meal yield and probably break rate with pen state particle separator. So how we can interpret that data? Sorting and probably.
Yeah. So again, I think that's one of the areas where that's obviously of interest now. Far off, right? So I know you're talking close up, right? But far off, there was a positive association with, more in the top screen, leading to better outcomes in general. I think that, to me, I wonder if that actually represents more forage level, feeding level in the diet, right? One of the things you got to be careful of in these studies is things move together, right? So you have more forage in that diet, we're gonna have more probably in the top screen. We feed less grain in those diets, right? Typically, so and again, if you do the math, the magnitude of relationships actually is not huge, right? So you keep that in mind. Close up, again, you're still looking at relatively small differences there at the end of the day, and so I think you got to keep that in mind. I think for us, we still like if you're looking at particle size of chopped straw or hay, that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in each of the three sections, or you add the bottom two together for a third in the 4-section Penn State box. 10 to 20% in the top screen, less than 40% of the pan in the bottom two. For close-up diets, I think you can be a little coarser with far-off diets and be okay, just because you don't have the same level of grain in the diet.
Right.
So.
Okay.
And of course, I think we all know feeding management of these diets, is also really important, right, from a particle size and moisture standpoint.
So moving to the fresh pen.
Yep.
There is a nice, I think, that association with NDF, digestible NDF, and effective UNDF with PREC. So that's pretty important, I think. Do you have any sweet spot where you want to be in the fresh pen?
So one of the things, you're kind of quoting some of the digestibility. So the PEU, the undigested NDF content of the diets, the physically effective, and so basically as those increased, we saw lower milk yields in lactation. To me, that just mostly comes back to just forage quality, right? So if you think about poor quality forages, right, they're going to have more UNDF, they have more PEUNDF, and so if we're feeding poor quality poor quality forages, from a digestibility standpoint, we're going to have likely less milk yield there. In terms of recommendations, I think one of the things that's tricky on that, and why we haven't really published a lot of recommendations on the UNDF or PEUNDF levels in diets, and we've done some of this work separately, has been the models aren't always fully seeded in terms of that data, especially for the non-forage fiber sources that might be in diets. And so what I tend to tell people is, if your typical UNDF 240 level in a lactating diet, high cow diet, for example, is around 7. You might run that fresh cow diet if you have one up around 8, maybe a little more. But I think any more than that's probably going to hold those cows back a bit, because we have had definite experience in our research group trying to do work in this area where we think some additional fiber for these fresh cows is beneficial, but it's very clear that you can hold them back if you go too far with that, especially if you go for longer. I think that about 10 to 14 days with a higher fiber strategy, especially higher forage fiber strategy in fresh cows. So that's something I think we're still kind of wrestling around with, but I think it's got implications for how we feed fresh cows going forward.
Tom, we're shoving a lot of data into a short period of time. If you were to summarize it for the audience, what would be just one or two key takeaways from the research so far? And then how do you see going forward with the research?
Yeah, so thanks, Scott. So I think, again, from a big, broad standpoint, I think both nutritional and non-nutritional factors come into play when we're looking at both transition cow outcomes, where there's disease or disorders, to some extent repro, and obviously milk production. Although again, we didn't see, at least nutritionally, in the big broad brush stroke, didn't see a lot of relationships there. I think our data support the efforts of the industry to decrease stocking density, especially the feed muck in these fresh groups and also pre-fresh groups. I think in general, our data also support that heifers, will do better if they're not commingled in this time frame. And I think also there's certain things on for example, group changes before calving. Herds that move cows less. In other words, no more than like a move to a close-up and then a move to calve. That appeared to be a better strategy in the data set than herds that move cows more frequently than that. Added an additional move or two. And I think that I think some of those things are consistent with what we think we see when we work with herds out in the industry, right? We see that herds that streamline those things, herds that pay attention to stocking density, herds that herds that those cows don't linger too long in the calving pen. I think that plays with what we see. Okay,
So Tom, a lot of those things, maybe the guys around this table take as common sense now. We've talked about it. More water, don't let them linger, plenty of space. But those farms that aren't doing that, is there a reason? How do we get them to make those simple, I guess I'm calling them simple adjustments. I don't know if they are. Maybe they're not on those farms.
Well, I think again, I think they just need to keep hearing it, right? I think from as many sources as possible, right? And we've been doing that, right? I mean, it feels like we've been doing that. I think that comes back into play. More information that continues to support, or the recommendations that a lot of us make, I think is helpful. And again, I think it's just part of that constant coaching that always happens in the dairy industry, whether it comes from, when you guys are working with farms, for example, right, with what you do, to nutritionists, veterinarians, others out in the industry, extension making, directly interfacing with herds.
Tom, thanks for stopping by here at the Real Science Exchange. It's always great to see you.
Nope, pleasure.
Look forward to seeing you next time.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Scott.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests, so please reach out via email to anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues with ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month, monogastric-focused topics on the second Tuesday of each month, and quarterly topics for the companion animal segment. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the latest schedule and to register for upcoming webinars.